Hello and welcome to WION Live Broadcast from London. I'm Ollie Barrett. These are the top stories this hour. Russia and the United States hold crucial talks in an attacking mode, with US Secretary of State Antony Blinken warning of united, swift and severe responses if Russia invades Ukraine. Responding to what it sees as an aggressive US stance during Geneva talks, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov says Russia does not expect a breakthrough on Ukraine and is seeking clarification on recent security demands. Aid from Australia and New Zealand arrives in Tonga as part of an international response after calls for urgent assistance from the island Pacific nation following that devastating volcanic eruption and tsunami caused by it. France will begin a gradual lifting of COVID restrictions from February the 2nd, amid what it calls encouraging signs that the wave of infections due to the Omicron variant is subsiding. Austria's parliament approves making COVID-19 vaccinations mandatory for adults from next month, becoming the first European country to do so, despite a wave of protests. And there won't be the blockbuster fourth round clash at the Australian Open that some were hoping for between the two biggest names in women's tennis. Defending champion and we'll start in the UK and come to the Geneva talks in a second. Rebel Conservative MPs who want to remove Boris Johnson as leader and British Prime Minister are accusing his government of blackmail. They say there have been attempts to intimidate lawmakers into supporting Boris Johnson with, it's claimed, threats to pull funding from projects from their constituencies. William Ragg was first to make the claims, and now MP Christian Wakeford, who defected from the Conservatives to the Labour Party this week, says threats were made to him by the whips in the Conservative Party.
I was threatened that I would not get the school for Radcliffe if I didn't vote one particular way. This is a town that's not had a high school for the best part of 10 years. And how do you feel when holding back a regeneration of a town for a vote? It didn't sit comfortably, and that was really that kind of starting to question my place where I was and ultimately to where I am now.
Boris Johnson is denying the claims.
I've seen no evidence, heard no evidence to support any of those allegations, Anushka, and what I'm focused on is what we're doing to deal with the number one priority of the British people, which is coming through COVID, and we've made enormous progress thanks to the vaccine rollout, fastest in Europe. The booster campaign has enabled us to open up. We're moving back to status quo ante, back to Plan A, opening up our economy. We've got the most open economy and society in Europe.
The opposition parties say this is all more evidence that Boris Johnson should quit. In Australia, the UK's Foreign Secretary Liz Truss, who is tipped as a potential frontrunner to replace the Prime Minister, offered him her support.
We are very close allies.
The Prime Minister has my 100% support. He is doing an excellent job. I want the Prime Minister to continue as long as possible in his job. He is doing a fantastic job.
Will you run for leadership?
There is no leadership election.
Well, that will be music to Boris Johnson's ears. He won a large majority in 2019 and is vowing to fight on, saying he plans to lead the Conservative Party into the next election. Well, we can speak to our London correspondent Giles Gibson now, who joins us live. And Giles, I haven't even mentioned parties in Downing Street yet. Where are we with all of that?
Well, Ollie, Sue Gray, who is the senior civil servant who is conducting this investigation into allegations of multiple parties and social gatherings held at number 10 Downing Street over the course of the coronavirus pandemic, and crucially during periods when the country was in lockdown, she could report or file her report in the coming days, perhaps as soon as Monday. And we know, of course, that some Conservative MPs have already sent in their letters to the chair of the 1922 committee, Graham Brady, indicating that they want to see a no confidence vote in UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Really, the fear for Boris Johnson and his team at number 10 Downing Street is that if this report from Sue Gray, when it does emerge, perhaps in the next few days or so, if it is very damning, if it is very explosive, then those potentially new revelations in this report as well could push some Conservative MPs over the edge, MPs who are wavering, and make them send their letters in as well. And that could lead us to the point where we get to that magic number of 54 letters sent in to the head of this committee of backbench Conservative MPs, which would then trigger a vote of no confidence in Boris Johnson. In the meantime, Ollie, we've had reports in UK media that Boris Johnson is going to be spending the weekend really trying to shore up his support amongst his colleagues, his Conservative colleagues in Parliament, perhaps having personal meetings and telephone calls over the course of the next couple of days to try to keep people on side and not send in those letters to the chair of the 1922 committee, which would trigger that vote of no confidence.
And Giles, on those claims of blackmail that are being made by some Conservative rebels, what are Conservative lawmakers more broadly saying about those allegations?
Well, Kwasi Kwarteng, who is the business secretary, has been sent out over the course of the morning to do the rounds on UK television and radio channels. He has said that there should be an investigation into these claims of intimidation and perhaps even blackmail of Conservative MPs. He's also said very clearly that there is no place for intimidation in terms of how the Conservative Party and how the Parliamentary Party works. However, he also was very clear. He said that he'd been a Member of Parliament for 12 years. He'd said he'd never ever seen this kind of behaviour before personally. And he was really casting doubt over whether these claims would actually be accurate. We've heard similar things from Boris Johnson himself, simply saying that there is absolutely no evidence as far as he's concerned that any Conservative MP has been blackmailed by the government's whip's office. As you would expect, the opposition Labour Party has come down very hard on this. They are saying that these claims are, quotes, shocking. Really, the question here, Ollie, is whether privately Conservative MPs themselves are shocked about these claims, or whether some of them simply see this as how Parliament works, that over the course of centuries that you've had potentially members of Parliament talking to government whips, doing deals behind the scenes, as you see in TV programmes such as House of Cards, for example.
OK, Giles, and to change gear a little, but while I've got you there, Ukraine, and we have those talks in Geneva today between the United States and Russia. We heard from Liz Truss earlier, who's in Australia at the moment. What is she saying, and what is the UK current position on that tension around Ukraine?
Well, we've seen some very tough rhetoric once again from the British Foreign Secretary Liz Truss during this speech that she gave in Australia. She said that Russia is trying to recreate the Soviet Union with this sort of behaviour on its frontiers with Ukraine. She also warned Russian President Vladimir Putin that it is now time for him to step back. That's a reference to the roughly 100,000 Russian troops that have been massing, that have been gathering on the border between Russia and Ukraine. And we've also seen the British this week, actually backing up that rhetoric from the Foreign Secretary and the government with action. We've seen the UK pledging to send more troops over to Ukraine to help train Ukrainian forces who are currently on their border. And the UK has also pledged to send more defensive weapons over to Ukraine as well.
OK, thank you very much, Giles. Giles Gibson reporting from London. And as we were saying, there are those crucial talks happening in Geneva today in Switzerland, the focus of much of the world's attention. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken meeting with his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov. Tension really is high between the two sides. No sense that the Americans are going to give in to those Russian security demands that Moscow has been making. This week we heard from US President Joe Biden, who gave a long press conference and was repeatedly asked about the tension around Ukraine. He appeared to create some confusion by suggesting that if Russia were to make some kind of minor incursion into Ukraine, then that would be different when it came to the response from the West than if there was a full-scale invasion. That was clarified later by the White House, saying that Joe Biden was really not talking about troops crossing the border, was talking about other potential moves that Russia could make. But as I say, not a huge amount of expectation that there will be a breakthrough in Geneva today. Let's hear from US Secretary of State Antony Blinken now.
We are, all of us, equally committed to the path of diplomacy and dialogue to try to resolve our differences. But we're also committed, if that proves impossible, and Russia decides to pursue aggression against Ukraine, to a united, swift, and severe response.
The Kremlin haven't learnt the lessons of history. They dream of recreating the Soviet Union or a kind of greater Russia, carving up territory based on ethnicity and language. They claim they want stability while they work to threaten and destabilize others. We know what lies down that path and the terrible toll in lives lost and human suffering it brings. That's why we urge President Putin to desist and step back from Ukraine before he makes a massive strategic mistake.
Next, the American lawmaker investigation into the 2021 US Capitol riots is intensifying its probe. The panel is now requesting an interview with Donald Trump's daughter, Ivanka Trump. The former White House aide has been asked to voluntarily cooperate. In January last year, Trump supporters stormed Congress. Ivanka Trump was then a senior advisor to her father. The House committees told her it has evidence that she pleaded with Donald Trump to call off the violence. It's claimed she observed a telephone conversation between her father and former Vice President Mike Pence on the morning of the attack. Donald Trump had attempted to persuade Mike Pence to reject the results of the election. The panel is also seeking information from Ivanka Trump about Donald Trump's plan to obstruct or impede the counting of electoral votes. The committee has already spoken to around 400 witnesses. Subpoenas have been issued for several key figures in Donald Trump's orbit, including White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows and one-time White House strategist Steve Bannon. The committee's also issued subpoenas to former New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani. He was a key figure in Donald Trump's failed bid to overturn the election. The House committees demanded information and testimony from Giuliani, Jenna Ellis, Sidney Powell and Boris Epstein. All four publicly defended Trump and his baseless voter fraud claims in the months after the election.
And the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I would consider a massive amount.
An American Airlines flight from Miami to London has turned around and flown back to the US because a female passenger refused to wear a face mask. She's been placed on the airline's no-fly customers list pending an investigation. It joins a list of mid-air mask disputes during the pandemic. In October, a passenger was accused of punching an American Airlines flight attendant in the nose, giving her a concussion. In May last year, a California woman on a Southwest Airlines flight repeatedly punched a flight attendant. She bloodied the attendant's face, chipped her teeth as well after being asked to wear her face mask properly. These episodes are not rare, according to the Federal Aviation Administration.
Video for Kieran. Can you keep your shot up a bit so we can get some video for
Last year, it received reports of 4,920 mask-related incidents. From January the 1st, 92 face mask-related incidents have already been reported. On the topic of masks, but changing tack slightly, in England they will no longer be mandatory in public places as the government moves away from so-called Plan B COVID restrictions. And this week the Education Secretary removed the requirement for masks to be worn in classrooms in secondary schools. He says the Education Department will reach out to teachers that don't drop masks, but some head teachers remain unconvinced and are defying the government's guidance. More than 100 schools have already written to parents to say that children must continue wearing masks in lessons. However, other schools have welcomed the change in guidance, although many will allow children who want to wear masks to continue to do so. Austria has become the first country in Europe to approve mandatory COVID-19 vaccinations for adults. The mandate begins next month, despite a wave of protests. The new legislation passed with 137 votes in favour and just 33 votes against in the 183-seat parliament. The measure was announced back in November. It was part of a bid to drive up the country's flagging vaccination rate. 72% of Austrian residents have now been fully vaccinated against the COVID-19 virus. The new law takes effect on February the 4th. Under the legislation, those holding out against the jab could face fines of up to $4,100. The measure applies to adults, except for pregnant women and those with a medical exemption.
Totalitarismus, das, was der Einzelne will, das zählt nicht mehr, es zählt nur mehr das, was für die Masse gut ist. Und das, was für die Masse gut ist, das werden uns in Zukunft Kapazunder vom Format eines Herrn Gesundheitsminister Mückstein vorgeben. Die werden uns sagen, was für die Masse gut ist, und derjenige, der sich nicht daran hält, wird verfolgt wie ein Krimineller.
To incentivize those who are still wavering, the government is launching a lottery for the vaccinated. €500 vouchers will be used as prizes. It can be used in shops, hotels, restaurants and cultural and sporting venues. The daily infection tolls in Austria continue to break records as well as elsewhere in Europe, including in France. But Prime Minister of France, Jean Castex, says the wave of infections due to the Omicron variant is subsiding. He says France will therefore begin a gradual lifting of restrictions.
L'évolution de la situation nous permet d'envisager un allègement des contraintes dès les premiers jours de février. Nous pouvons l'envisager parce que nous disposerons très bientôt d'un nouvel outil, le pass vaccinal, que la représentation nationale a voté et qui entrera en vigueur lundi prochain, le 24 janvier, sous réserve bien sûr de la décision du Conseil constitutionnel attendue demain.
From January the 24th, a certificate of vaccination will be required to enter public venues like restaurants, cafes and cinemas. Since the announcement of that vaccine pass, 1 million French people have got vaccinated. 93% of French adults have had at least one dose. COVID cases appear to be plummeting in Africa. According to the United Nations, cases have dropped in Africa and COVID-related deaths have also declined for the first time since the fourth wave of the virus. The WHO, meanwhile, has termed the region's 56-day virus flare-up from the Omicron variant as Africa's shortest upsurge yet. South Africa, where the Omicron variant was first detected, has been recording a downward trend for the past 4 weeks. The United States also seems to be emerging, or at least parts of it do, from the latest wave of the pandemic. Declines are most pronounced in states that were hit first by the wave, particularly in the northeast, including New York, Jersey and Maryland. And let's go now to Geneva, where Sergei Lavrov is speaking.
As Secretary Blinken told me several days ago during our telephone conversations, these questions and our answers would help the US side clarify and better prepare their responses to our initiatives. And this is how it was today. Good day, Irada Zainalova, NTV, Minister Lavrov. In the 1970s, when Helsinki was signed, it took 3 years. In 2009, we suggested signing a treaty on European security. So, do you think these agreements, all of them, can simply be stymied and that they're just dragging their feet? Well, our experience of talking to our Western counterparts on European security, this experience is full of examples like the one you have just cited, when something was promised and then the promise was not kept. I remembered what the US President said after the Helsinki Final Act was signed in 1975. I think it was Gerald Ford, and he said, solemnly marking this event of signing the Helsinki Final Act, and he said the descendants would judge us not on the promises we give, but on how good we keep them. So in that sense, our American counterparts and other Western Europeans and members of NATO, they're not very good at keeping that. But once again, you heard today repeated the arguments saying that countries are free to choose their alliances, security arrangements, but we cited a number of documents that condition this freedom to choose one's security arrangements on the commitment not to strengthen one's security at the expense of other countries' security. And we asked Mr. Blinken and his team to comment on how exactly they interpret these commitments that were adopted at the OSCE at the highest level and were on multiple occasions confirmed there. Secretary Blinken said that he is satisfied with the exchange of views that we've just had, and this will help them present us in writing their reaction next.
Foreign Minister, hi, over here to your right. If I may in English, sorry, my Russian's not quite up to it. Last night the State Department put out a load of information in which they said there was no threats heading from Ukraine towards Russia. In that information they also said that RT, my network, was directly responsible for propaganda, for reporting on neo-Nazis and right-wing groups within Ukraine. This is something that Human Rights Watch has also said. What's the Russian Foreign Ministry's response to these statements from the State Department? Also, how has the amount of weaponry from both the United States and UK that has been arriving in Ukraine, how has that affected the talks that you've been having with the Secretary of State?
Вы все за меня уже рассказали, конечно.
Well, you said everything for me. These documents the State Department has prepared, especially for today's meeting. It's impossible to read these documents, but we have a special department which is headed by a special envoy of the ministry, and they are charged with studying all of that, and the response has already been given. I do not think that we should additionally comment on that. You just have to, look at these pages. You can randomly open a page, and if you read what's written there, you see that it holds no water, whatever. It falls under critical analysis. It's lies, pure and simple in many cases. Now, as far as Ukraine is concerned, we talked about it. Once again, our American counterparts once again tried to push to the forefront the issues at the border between Russia and Ukraine. They tried to condition everything on the need of the so-called de-escalation, which has turned into some kind of a mantra. But I would like to reiterate once again, at the end of our meeting, we agreed that next week the US is going to present us with written answers to all of our proposals. And you also said, in particular, that Ukraine represents no threat to Russia. And I would like to once again remind everyone who analyzes our public statements and our analysis, and I would like to say that never before has Russia threatened through its official representatives the Ukrainian people. Well, the Western colleagues have taken President Zelensky under their wing, condoning anything he does. And President Zelensky said that if some Ukrainian citizen doesn't feel Ukrainian and feels Russian, he should get out of the country. And those who fight the state terrorism in Donbass, well, he dubbed them, as you might remember, not people, but, specimens. So we do not rule out that all these hysterics propounded by our Western counterparts seeks, well, if not to provoke some forceful actions by Ukraine in Donbass, well, then at least it seeks to, hide Kyiv's attempts to sabotage the Minsk agreements. I see no other option. As far as allegations go, we have responded to everything, and when someone tells us that, yes, that's your territory, we recognize that, but there are too many troops, but at the same time, they say that it's not our business what the Americans do with their troops in Europe. And this is something we discussed with Antony Blinken during our talks today, and he agreed that the dialogue has to be more reasonable. Emotions will recede to the back.
Was there any headway made on any of the points past couple of weeks in which you said were very key to your security concerns? And then also, do you come out of this meeting satisfied, disappointed? How would you summarize it? And then, first and foremost, how big do you think right now the threat of war is in Europe through some sort of miscalculation with obviously such a large force gathering around Ukraine? And finally, one question that a lot of people I think have been asking internationally is, why is Russia doing this now? Why do you feel that you need to make these troop deployments now when really the security posture of the US and NATO really hasn't changed over the past couple of years?
Значит, у вас видите, какая манера-то оказывается. Я думаю, что государственному департаменту надо еще...
Well, you see, I think the State Department has to analyze how CNN works with regard to the accuracy of information. You say that we intend to attack Ukraine, even though on multiple occasions we have said that we never intended to do that. And when you say that this is going to happen, you ask the next question, why now? This is a very strangely formulated question. As far as our approach goes, with regard to the need to put an end to an indefinite enlargement of NATO eastwards, we once again reiterated this approach, and Secretary Blinken once again reaffirmed his position with regard to each and every country's state to have the right to their own security arrangements. And I in turn asked how, it fits with the commitment not to reinforce one's security at the expense of security of others, and he promised me that they would respond to how the US interprets that. This is not the end of our dialogue, as I said, and next week, as Secretary Blinken has said on many occasions, we will get a written reaction to our initiative. Now, as far as the principled issue of NATO's non-enlargement goes, everyone is asking us why. Well, the thing is, it was set up against the Soviet Union, and for some reason it still works against Russia, and this is something that is enshrined in the doctrinal documents. Just to cite an example, let's take the Eastern Europeans, Poles in particular, the Baltic states. When they were aspiring to become NATO members, we were warning that this would be a mistake, that this would not strengthen NATO's security. We warned that this would only fuel extremist sentiment. On many occasions they said it's quite the opposite. They were telling us we will accept them into NATO, and these phobias passed down from the Soviet times will simply disappear, and these are going to be your peaceful neighbors. But it turned out to be quite the opposite. The Russophobic minority, headed by these countries, Poland and the Baltic, are setting the tune, not just in NATO, but also in the European Union, making others pursue this deadlock policy with regard to Russia on all issues. So, CNN, I would like to call on you to be more accurate with your facts. Izvestia, please. Nikolai Ivanov, even in his introductory remarks, Secretary Blinken was threatening. He said there would be a response to an aggression in Ukraine. So there's going to be a written response next week. So do you think the tonality is something you understand right now, that it can be predicted, or do you think something different is going to happen? As I said, once again, our American counterparts tried to put Ukraine to the foreground during our today's discussion. I understand that they have kept their concerns, but still, after our explanations, they understood that they have to concentrate on the substance, on the essence of our proposals. And a promise was given to us, I'd like to reiterate that, to provide us with a written response to our proposals next week. And I'm confident that in this or that way, Ukraine will still figure in those responses. But I have not heard any single argument today that would corroborate the U.S. position on what's happening in the Ukrainian-Russian border. Just concerns. Our concerns regarding not just some imagined threat, our concerns about real facts, the facts that no one is hiding, the fact that weapons are being handed over to Ukraine, that hundreds of military instructors are flocking to Ukraine right now. The EU doesn't want to lag behind the US and wants to set up a training camp in Ukraine. So it's going to be quite an interesting turn in the EU's ambitions. Maybe this is an attempt by the EU to remind everyone of its existence, because so far it doesn't figure in the serious conversations. Yes, we understand that this issue requires a great deal of attention, but we shouldn't reduce the issue of European security architecture to this single issue. Regarding Ukraine, Secretary Blinken has reaffirmed what President Biden has said. He said that they are willing to help promote the implementation of the Minsk agreements, and I have called him to once again exercise their influence on the Kyiv regime to get back to their senses and to stop sabotaging this most important document that is supposed to put an end to the Ukrainian conflict. Irina, there is Russia Today Spanish. Have you touched upon the possible deployment of Russian infrastructure on Cuba, in Venezuela? How serious is this eventuality from the point of view of Russia, and are you engaged in talks with the governments of these countries? We have not touched upon this topic in our negotiations today. Task, please. Minister Lavrov, good afternoon. You said this is not your last contact, this is just a preliminary contact. You said that your contacts are going to continue, and after the written response of the US, there will be more contacts. Is a summit possible, and how can you comment on the decision to provide greater military assistance to Ukraine, in particular the artillery, munitions, even though the government of the Czech Republic said that it doesn't want to be on the list of non-friendly nations that was drawn by Moscow. So can you comment on that too? So I forgot your first question. Yes, is a summit possible? I told you that we are waiting for a written response, and once this happens, we will plan a new contact at our level. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. President Putin is always ready for contacts with President Biden, but these contacts have to be prepared very seriously, and we need to understand what the outcome should be if we decide to tap into the potential of our leaders, as it were. As far as the Czech government is concerned, we hear these statements. But, of course, we need these words to turn into concrete proposals, concrete signals addressed to us. And I cannot comment on what our NATO neighbors are doing, our EU neighbors are doing with regard to Ukraine. On many occasions, we have warned that the only thing that the Kiev regime is doing is speculating on this patronage provided to it by its Western sponsors. Once this Russophobic hysteria stops, everyone will see crystal clear that this regime is inviolable.
Jamie Keaton, Associated Press. Thank you for taking my question. I think a lot of people in the world are very concerned about these conversations, like the one with Mr. Ryabkov and Ms. Sherman last week, and the ones today. There can be some sort of progress that is being made today. You mentioned the written response from the United States next week. Could you characterize that for us, please? Is that a step in the right direction? Do you see that as a concession from the United States? And how long is Russia going to be willing to wait for satisfactory answers?
Well, do I have to tell you everything? Well, you know, this attempt to go into each and every detail, well, I do not think it's useful right now. I have told you everything I needed to about our today's constructive, useful discussion. I cannot say whether we are on the right path or not. We will understand that once we get the American response in writing to all the points that we've enumerated. Good afternoon, Konstantin Koreshnikov, Zvezda TV channel. The State Duma is discussing the initiative to recognize the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic. So do you think if Washington refuses to agree to these security guarantees, is Russia gonna be willing to recognize these republics? The State Duma is discussing the initiative to recognize the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic. So do you think if Washington refuses to agree to these security guarantees, is Russia gonna be willing to recognize these republics after the referendum takes place there? Well, I'm not going to speculate on that. I think the Kremlin has spoken on that already. As far as the referendum is concerned, I think this was a turning point in the history of the Ukrainian crisis after the bloody coup d'etat. And so far the State Department is trying to avoid our question as to what really had happened there from the point of view of the West. So they decide to say that, yes, there was this, and then the Crimea happened, and then the insurgency in Donbass, and then we try to remind them about the peaceful agreements between President Yanukovych and the opposition. You were the guarantors of those agreements, Poland, France, and Germany, and next morning the opposition simply tore those agreements down, putting forth Russophobic comments, requiring that Russians had to be expelled from the Crimea, and then there were militants sent to the Crimea to seize the Supreme Council, which led to a revolt of the Crimeans who demanded a referendum. Now, as for Donbass, the referendum that took place in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions was seriously discussed at the Normandy format meeting when the Minsk agreements were prepared. And the leaders of France and Germany were asking us to persuade the representatives of Donetsk and Luhansk to put their signature to those Minsk agreements. So, as a matter of fact, they decided to accommodate the Normandy 4, and they revoked their previous decision on independency, but only under the condition that the Minsk agreements would be respected, namely the special status that had to be granted to these territories. The special status had to be enshrined in the Ukrainian constitution, and the decentralization that had to happen, and of course whole amnesty, and once again elections had to be held, but everything had to be done in coordination with Donetsk and Luhansk. Well, this is where we are with the status of these territories. We spoke about that today, and we spoke about that when Foreign Minister of Germany visited us, and we spoke with the French, and we said that everyone has to stop condoning the actions of the Kiev regime. They have to do what was agreed by the UN Security Council.
In the week, Emmanuel Macron proposed a new European security order to stand together against Russia. What do you think about this new order? Is it a provocation for you?
I
didn't get that. Could you repeat your question, please? President Macron said that a new security order has to be created against Russia?
He proposed a new order of security for Europe, and he said it's to stay strong against Russia. Is it a provocation for you?
Я не слышал, чтобы президент Макрон призывал создать что-то против России.
Well, I didn't hear President Macron say anything about creating anything against Russia. I know that President Macron is a steady advocate of increasing the capacity of the EU to play greater role in world politics. He is a proponent of the EU's strategic autonomy. I know there is a program, the so-called strategic compass. We follow that. We understand that there is a strong influence of the so-called Russophobes, and they didn't calm down. But I did not hear President Macron citing the need to stand firm against Russia when he proposed this security order. I think there is some misunderstanding.
From the BBC. What does Russia want most? An unstable, dependent Ukraine, or a new sphere of influence in Eastern Europe?
Well, you know, we spoke about spheres of influence today as well. Well, an unstable Ukraine is indeed a factor of our everyday political life, but this instability, well, I know you are an experienced journalist, and I do understand where this instability comes from. If you look at what's happening around Poroshenko's return to Kiev, all the subsequent events, how it's all organized, As for spheres of influence go, I asked Anthony Blinken today, I asked him to explain, well, after President of Kazakhstan asked for help to the CSTO based on the CSTO chapter for assistance in suppressing the terrorists, and there were demands that Kazakhstan should explain why it did what it did. This illustrates that the West is confident of its own special status. They are allowed to do everything, others are not allowed to do anything. Look at how the EU is behaving. Let's remember Mr. Borrell's predecessor as High Representative of the EU, Federica Mogherini, and back in 2018, when she spoke at the meeting of the EU permanent representatives, she said, I almost quote her directly, she said about the Balkans, if the EU is present there, there is no place where anyone else in this region. I think this is a very good illustration, and this applies to what's happening in Eastern Europe. Let's look at the West Balkans. There are some countries that are not part of NATO and the EU there, and attempts are undertaken to make them associate themselves. They're trying to dissuade them from having good close ties with China, with Russia. Is it not about trying to introduce their own sphere of influence? Spheres of influence exist due to the policies pursued by colonial powers. When decolonization happened, colonial powers didn't want to lose their influence. And spheres of influence was about trying to still, control. It was about controlling these territories. And they're trying to expand their presence in these territories and attract new ones into their sphere of influence. We spoke about that with Mr. Blinken today, and it's a pity that adult people are involved in this, measuring contest, who's tougher, who's cooler. If we all assume the adult attitude, and if we think about how we can make this world a safe place to live in, given the climate change, drug trafficking, terrorism, health issues, because people run terrible risks because of the pandemic, and I'm afraid this is not the last pandemic. These are the issues we have to think about instead of trying to reduce all of these problems to the US-Russia relations or to how President Zelensky feels in his regime. It's not true. We're not trying to get a sphere of influence. But what NATO is doing shows us unequivocally that NATO considers Ukraine to be a part of its sphere of influence. Darenika Vishnikova, RBC. Please, could you repeat that, please? Yes. Is the Foreign Ministry going to publish the U.S. response to your proposals? Well, this is not a question to us. This is a question to our American counterparts. So far, there is no response, so we're not going to raise this issue. So far, it's going to be their property which they're going to hand over to us. So I think I would like to make this response public, but I'm going to have to consult Secretary Blinken on that. Thank you.
And there we go. That was the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov holding a press conference after his much-anticipated talks with the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken. Lavrov emphasized that this meeting is not the final round. There is another meeting expected. Russia never threatened Ukrainian people. That is what Lavrov has said. And Russia also hopes that the US will decrease emotions in dialogue, but there are no guarantees. That's what the Russian Foreign Minister has said. After holding these crucial talks with his American counterpart, the Foreign Minister says that Russia now expects a US written response to the security demands next week, asserting that it has never threatened the Ukrainian people. Also expected soon is, of course, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken's press conference. We will get you all updates from there. And now time for a quick break on WION World is One. Global news updates continue on the other side of this short break.